Today, May the 10th, 1972, from the city of Bartlesville, Oklahoma, we are interviewing Mr. Elmer J. Sark of 705 South Delaware, who is a resident of Bartlesville. This interview is being taken by James Cadigan for the Oklahoma Historical Society and the Oklahoma Living Legends. Mr. Stark, let's start this interview by having you to bring us up on some of your background as to when you might made your entry into Oklahoma and what you might want to say back in this part of the history of Oklahoma.
Well, when I came here in the spring of 1913, I was told that if I would stay here 6 months, I'd never leave. Now, an explanation was not given at that time, but I found out shortly that if I didn't leave before 6 months, I couldn't unless I walked out. Oil was selling for 15 cents a barrel at that time, and they would give you 2 or 3 cents a barrel if you would haul it away in tank wagons. And I got some of that oil on my hands, and it was no trouble to find a job, and I accepted the chief engineership of the Bartlesville Oil Company, which was the largest producing oil company in Oklahoma at that time. And that job paid $75 a month. And I have stayed here. I like it here. And the missus has agreed that this is as good a place as she wants. So we were raised 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And we're very fond of Bartlesville, and we're very fond of Oklahoma. And we hope we have contributed something to the advancement and the development of this great state. Now, give you a little insight on my interest in and experience with history is I'm a life member of the Oklahoma Historical Society. I'm a charter member of the Bartlesville Historical Commission and the Washington County Historical Society. I served as historian for the James H. Steele Post American Legion from 1918 to 1968. And I have had some classes in our high schools in the county on history, and I find it very interesting work. And I have some brochures. I don't go in for big books. The biggest book I ever compiled was the American Legion History. And I go more for these brochures on a particular subject, just to get them lined up. I'll mention the Baptist Church history and who brought Christianity into Oklahoma. And then in 1967, I compiled another brochure entitled 100 Years in Oklahoma. And that covers the Delaware-Cherokee Treaty that brought the Delawares into the Cherokee Nation. Now then, I'm working on one known as the Nellie Johnston Oil Well #1 in Oklahoma. And I'm bringing into that the green country idea. And I have a number of interesting pictures with it. And some of your Oklahoma Historical Society members were down here for some dedications. And I could go on quite a little on either one or any one of these 4 brochures that I have, and I go more to a particular subject, and without getting too far away and getting lost and have to come back. But I don't know whether you'd be interested in some of my experiences since I've been in Oklahoma or not. And I might tell you that in 1928, the Phillips Petroleum Company had the Beechcraft Airplane Company at Wichita, Kansas, build the first Camry airplane in their history. And that was for me to operate in South America, and we were supposed to be down there about a year. Well, plans went away, but we still kept the plane, and we did an awful lot of surveys, aerial surveys, in Oklahoma and other states. And that was one of my most pleasant experiences. I love it in the air. And I've had a few hundred hours up there looking down on everybody, I might say, on everything. And I have recorded a lot of stuff that I think has been and will be interesting to the people of Oklahoma. And we made the first aerial view of Bartlesville from the air. And a number of you may remember the old Dewey Roundup. Billy Parker was my pilot, and most anybody that's ever been interested in air in Oklahoma knows who Billy Parker is. He is today the oldest living flyer in the world, still flying. And his friendship has been a great pleasure to me. And we made we photographed and mapped such places as the Willow Rock Lodge or Frank Phillips Ranch, and some of our big pipelines crossing from Texas to Illinois. And along that line of work, and it's been very enjoyable. And being an engineer, I went from groundwork to the air, and then I was retired from Phillips on January the 1st, 1950. And I'm in my 23rd year of retirement now. And I don't think that my retirement took the first time because I'm busier now than I was then. And I keep busy in a number of ways. This history business is a real challenge to me in trying to get some of these older Indians and white folks, early day ones in here, to tell me for recording some of their experiences. And I have quite a collection of those that I really cherish. And I have in my files about 8,000 photographs and negatives for the most of them. And there's a historian back east that comes to see me once in a while and in correspondence with him continually about some of these experiences and some of these people and some photographs to go with his work back there. Now, on the family side of it, I'll only go back to our coming to Oklahoma. But we have stayed here and reared 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy. And the good Lord blessed us with 3, and we still have those 3. And they're all within visiting distance of Bartlesville. And they're all busy and healthy. Hold it for a minute.
Mr. Sark, you have quite a historical background of the church in Oklahoma. Will you give us some of your recollections as members, as you remember the beginning of the church in this territory and state?
The first church in this part of the country was made about 1867, when the Delawares came down into the Cherokee Nation, and some of them settled on the banks of the Caney River at what is now Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And Arthur Armstrong and William Johnston were instrumental in building a building that was used as a community building for church and school and any community need. And it was located at about the north edge or north end of Wyandotte Avenue or Delaware Avenue. And it was used for a time, and then they got a preacher from Kansas. I don't just know the town now, but he came down here and established a Sunday school. And then they had the Indian preachers come in from Allowee. That was Charles Journeycake's home church, and the Silver Lake Baptist Church. And they divided the preacher between those two and Bartlesville, and had preaching services about every other week at each place. Then they finally moved up to the corner of the southwest corner of 4th Street and Cherokee Avenue and built the first church in 1896, I believe it was. And that burned, and then they built, that was a frame church. Then they replaced that with a brick church that I believe they used until about 1926. And they have, at this time, the 3rd church on that same lot in that time. All big improvements, and the present church is quite an edifice, and we think it's one of the best Baptist churches in this part of the country. Now, in mentioning the Baptist here, more particularly, because I was preparing this brochure for the dedication of a part of the new church. I do have records and photographs of any number of the early day churches in Bartlesville that I probably could find and reproduce. But that is the history of the Baptist Church. But the real thing that I would like to mention is who brought Christianity into Oklahoma. And it was the Cherokees and the Delawares. Now the Delawares had some nice churches, and they still have some nice churches. But in a general summary of what I know about Christianity and religion in Oklahoma was what I have been giving you here. Now then, I do not have available at this time one of those brochures, but I would be glad to file a copy of it, to complete this details on this interview. Now then,
Mr. Sark, we have heard about your historical writings. We're really interested in your current writings. Right now, we would like you to tell us about your historical writings of the 100 years in Oklahoma.
This is a little 1867 to 1967. And it just touches briefly on the Spanish and French explorers who were supposed to have been the first people in here. But we don't have too much on that, and that's probably the same condition with you folks and what you're trying to find now. But what I have tried to do is to produce a picture or photograph of the tribal councils of both the Cherokees and the Delawares, taken in 1867. Now, and then I had to go to the Smithsonian Institution to get a copy of the treaty that was signed between the two tribes at that time, and that is included in this brochure, together with the photographs of the two councils. And it's my understanding that this is the only brochure anyone knows about or can find that covers completely this transaction by a copy of the treaty itself and the two tribal councils. And I've had a great number of compliments on it by people who are interested in history and have secured a copy of it and studied it and tell me that it is the most complete, brief record of the transaction that they know of. Now this treaty is written in longhand, and to tell you that some of these early day Indians couldn't read or write makes you laugh, because they write better than I do. Now then, after getting that completed, I contacted W.W. Keeler, Principal Chief of the Cherokees, who is to represent the tribe, and Nate Young, who is a grandson of one of the Delaware tribal members at the time this treaty was signed. And they, together with our local history room librarian in Bartlesville, uh, Gene Wynn, and myself, I'm presenting an enlarged photograph framed in walnut, and immediately above that, a little box of the same material to hold these brochures as it's placed in the history room of the Bartlesville Public Library. Now then, that much more could be said and written about this treaty and the results of it, because it brought the two tribes together to form the greatest tribe of Indians in the United States. And that was their purpose, to build a strong Indian nation that could best serve their purposes. And I don't know where I could find anything more, unless you would want to get away from the subject of 100 Years in Oklahoma, which deals strictly and exclusively with the Delaware-Cherokee Treaty.
Mr. Stark, we would like also for you to go into your history that you have compiled about the Nellie Johnston well number 1 in Oklahoma, here in Bartlesville.
To start off with, I might tell you that when possible, I have supplemented my writings on these different subjects with photographs. And I believe I mentioned earlier that I had something like 8,000 photographs in my files. Now then, I also use maps occasionally to show where certain things are. And I'm looking now at a map that shows the first survey in 1897, the second survey in 1898, and the original town site survey that included both of the above-mentioned plats for Bartlesville, Oklahoma, that was made in 1902. And I'll just give you a little information on the Nellie Johnston. Going to the Nellie Johnston well number 1 in Oklahoma, I think it would be well to tell you something about who Nellie Johnston was. And some of her early day connections of family and businessmen with her father and other early day people here. So Nellie Johnston was born on August the 13th, 1890, in the Cherokee Nation in the Indian Territory, the second daughter of William and Lily Armstrong Johnson, and a granddaughter of Chief Charles Journeycake, the last chief of the Indian Delawares. She and Howard D. Cannon were married on March the 24th, 1912, and he still resides in Bartlesville. William Johnston was born December 10, 1859 in Montreal, Canada, and came to Cooties Bluff, Cherokee Nation, Indian Territory in 1876 with his parents. He and Miss Lily Armstrong were married January the 12th, 1882, and she was of Delaware Indian blood. She died January the 13th, 1893. George B. Keeler was born February the 7th, 1850 in Hempville, Illinois, and came to Indian Territory October the 13th, 1871, as an Indian trader. He was adopted into both the Osage and Cherokee tribes about 1872. Both of his wives were of Cherokee blood. He married Miss Jenny Gilstrap in August of 1872, and she died July 1893, and he later married Miss Josephine Cass. Now then, you've got a kind of a background of genealogy there, but some of the others we think we should know about. Wondered if oil under the surface in Bartlesville was of a sufficient quantity to pay for drilling wells. And as they drove along, they thought and talked about this, but their horses they rode were only interested in water and would drink only after the riders scraped oil from the surface of the water. Now, this was the first recorded interest that these early men had in finding oil here. In 1875, Mr. George B. Keeler checked some of the oil slicks in the vicinity of Bartlesville and talked with Mr. Johnston, Jake Bartles, and others about the time of the Johnstone Keeler store was opened on the south side of the Caney River. John F. Overfield came here from Chicago during 1893, liked the territory and decided to stay, and became a permanent resident and very much interested in oil. These men knew little about oil, but were trying to learn about it from anyone they knew, and at the same time realized they would have to find land on which to drill if they wanted to drill some wells. Keeler, Johnstone, and Overfield made several trips to Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, trying to convince the Cherokee Council, and then to Washington, D.C. to see the Secretary of the Interior. Oil and gas leases on Indian lands was unknown. And George B. Keeler was the first granted and in the Cherokee Nation. And the one for drilling the Nellie Johnston well was not only the first well drilled, but proved to be the first producing oil well in the Cherokee Nation, but also the Indian Territory, now a part of Oklahoma. Now I found a very interesting thing the other day on the teamsters that brought this rig in from down by Broken Arrow or Sapulpa, and I have the story that he gave me of how they brought that standard rig in. And one of particular interest to me was how they crossed the Canadian River at Tulsa, what was later to become Tulsa. And they did this hauling in January. They had 20 wagons, and they had 3 teams for each wagon. And when they came to the river, it was frozen over, and they had to break the ice to get through. And they built a big fire on each bank of the river that not only served as a guidepost for their crossing, but also to warm themselves and dry their clothes after a wet, cold crossing. Now that I think a lot of, because it is recording what somebody else had experienced in the development of oil here, and particularly the drilling of the Nellie Johnston well. Right now, I'm looking at an 8 by 10 photograph of that well being shot. And this is autographed by Nellie Johnston Cannon for me, and shows her sitting off to one side looking over the back of the buckboard that she came in. And this, I have seen some pictures of drilling masts that were supposed to have been this well, but this is a 68-foot standard rig, wooden rig, and Nellie said this is the identical rig that they drilled a well with. So I try to, if I find something interesting, and I want it to be history, I check and double check and come up with the best evidence I can find that it is real and genuine. Now, on January the 13th, 1926, Nellie Johnston Cannon and her husband, Howard D. Cannon, signed a deed for the Johnston Park, consisting of 37 and 900 acres, for the sum of $6,000, and this land contained the Nellie Johnston number well in the city of Bartlesville. They insist that the name shall remain the Johnston Park. In May the 5th, 1922, Frank Griggs of the Griggs Studio here, a great friend of mine, was requested to obtain an interview with and a photograph of George B. Keeler and the Nellie Johnston well, and the following is the result.
Mr. Sark, tell us about what you remember and what you reminisce about the well, the Nellie Johnston oil well number 1, in the drilling and the construction and the shooting of the wells. Some of your knowledge on this great well.
The original well log shows that it was spudded in late in January of 1897, and the Oswego lime was found at 880 to 942 feet. The latent sand was 975 to 987 feet, and a gas sand was found from 1,252 to 1,267 feet, and a new initial production and later the Bartlesville sand was found at 1,303 feet to 1,320 feet. The well was completed and shot on April the 19th, 1897, and it came in with an initial production of 25 to 75 barrels per day, which could not be gauged accurately. from this Bartlesville sand, and the story of the shooting of this well adds another interesting item to early day history. Miss Jenny Cass, the daughter of Mrs. George B. Keeler, dropped the Go Devil, a four-winged piece of cast iron. The size, length, and weight is controlled by the size of the casing, and at times by the amount of fluid in the well. The nitroglycerine was placed in the well in cans of varying sizes and numbers, and by quarts, and the plunger had a plunger on the last can with a cap that was set off the shot.
Mr. Sark, can you relate to us what preparations are made or what means you had of disposing and handling of oil from this well when it came in?
There were no storage tanks, no pipelines, and no railroad tankers. And this condition prevailing at the time the well was shut in until August of 1903, when the land and lease titles were established and the Cudahy Oil Company cleaned and deepened the well from 1,320 to 1,345 feet, shot it again and put it on the beam with production about 30 barrels a day at 29-degree gravity. By this time, there were also an outlet for this oil by railroad cars to the refinery at Neosho, Kansas, until the Prairie Oil and Gas Company completed a pipeline to this vicinity in December of 1904. On November the 15th, 1899, the Bartlesville Oil and Gas Company was organized in an effort to acquire the entire oil and gas production and arranged for shipment to outside markets. Now, officers elected were A.P. McBride from Independence, Kansas, George B. Keeler, Vice President of Bartlesville, Indian Territory, and William Johnston, Secretary, also of Bartlesville. On April 18, 1903, approximately 6 years after the drilling of the Nellie Johnston No. 1 well, 56 producing oil wells had been drilled within a radius of a few miles with an average daily production of 25 barrels, and the Standard Oil Company has selected Bartlesville as its base for operations in this area. On Saturday, November the 16th, 1907, Oklahoma and Indian Territory were married, otherwise united, to become the 46th state and were admitted to the Union by order of the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And the state wedding of these two young territories was a pleasant and a memorial event that was proud of the new state of Oklahoma. We had crude oil here before we had a state of Oklahoma. Now then, I'm looking at a picture of the shot of the Nellie Johnston well. And it is autographed by Nellie because of confusion of what kind of a rig used in drilling the well. And she signs this as being shot on April the 15th, 1897. And in the picture is a buckboard with the top down. And Nellie tells me that she is the little girl looking over the back of that buckboard watching the shot. On May the 5th, 1922, Frank N. Griggs of the Griggs Studio in Bartlesville was requested to obtain an interview with and a photograph of George B. Keeler and the Nellie Johnston well. And I'm looking at that picture of Mr. Keeler standing by the well, and it's still on pump. Now that was on May the 15th, 1922. Now then, that I think we better go now to in 1941, the Bureau of Mines was dedicating a new building here, and in addition to that, they placed a big granite marker near this Nellie Johnston well and dedicated it with quite a little ceremony over there. Then the old rig began to crumble and got dangerous, so the Chamber of Commerce decided to remove that derrick and put up another one, and they did. And on Friday, March 12, 1948, Mayor R.H. Hudson for the city of Bartlesville at a Chamber of Commerce meeting accepted a deed for the Nellie Johnston well from Howard Cowden, president of the Cooperative Refining Company. And in April of 1948, the company pulled and plugged the well after it had produced more than 100,000 barrels of oil in 43 years from the Bartlesville sand. Now the second replica has been erected, and it is one of the top historical sites in this part of the country, because people come here from all over the United States and stop to see the first oil well in Oklahoma. Now then, in 1964, when this last replica was placed, it called for quite a meeting, and some representatives from the Oklahoma Historical Society were down here to have part in the dedication of the new replica and a highway marker, which was placed along the highway east of town. I'm looking at a picture now of W.W. Keeler, chief of the Cherokee tribe, Nellie Johnston Cannon, and John Steiger, who was chairman of the Historical Committee of the Chamber of Commerce. And then we have a picture of this new replica in full and covered with snow. And then at the marker, I have another photograph of Nellie Cannon and Muriel Wright from the Historical Society, Robert Newcomb, I think he was with the Oklahoma Highway Commission, and Elmer Fraker, who was the executive secretary of the Historical Society. We have Reverend Will Carl of the Presbyterian Church across the road from where the marker was placed, and Arch Little, who was from the Chamber of Commerce, and John Steiger. And that about brings us down to 64, and there hasn't been any activity around the well till that time, or since that time. Now, there are other things that I could have included here, but we have some other things we want to consider, so I'll check it back to Mr. Mack here for a minute and see what he has in mind.
Mr. Sark, we know you are a member of the Field Resters Club. Can you give us some information about this club and where it started and what it's been built up to the present time? And also, bring us up with some information about your activities in the Senior Citizens Club.
My retirement was January the 1st, 1950, and I had a heart spell, put me out of circulation for a while. Now, gave me plenty of time to think about some old friends. So I contacted a number of the retired employees of Phillips and got a hearty response and an encouragement to go ahead and organize a social club, which I did in 1952 with 6 charter members. And today we have better than 4,000 members in that club, and they're scattered over 43 states and 2 foreign countries. And we're still very much of a growing concern, and not only the retirees, but the Phillips Petroleum Company themselves have told us that they like the club and want to keep it going. Now then, on the senior citizens, I am a charter member of the Bartlesville Senior Citizens Club, and we started with 6 members, but I can't tell you how many we have now, but something like 400, as I understand. And the YMCA is very generous in furnishing us a room to meet in twice a month in what we call the Y Hut. And our interest is growing there too, and it seems that we've hit on a favorite chord in trying to continue sociability and friendship and consideration for each other.
Mr. Sark, you are familiar and no doubt had quite a bit to do with the Dewey Roundup, and also in taking the pictures of the Roundup. We'd like some information or some historical value on the Roundup, and as you could see it also with photos.
The first Roundup anywhere that we've been able to learn about was in 1908. Colonel Jacob H. Bartles was enlisted in or served with a cavalry company in Kansas. And he was dying with cancer, but he wanted to know about his old buddies, and so they got together and decided to put on a roundup. That's the difference between a roundup and a rodeo. Is a roundup is a contest, and a rodeo is a show. So they set up a tent village on just east of the Dewey Hotel for the soldiers, and for the cowboys and the cattle, they built another tent village down on the old Joe Knight farm, and they put on the first roundup that we know of anywhere in the United States in 1908. My first showing of the Roundup was in 1913 when the show was put on the Joe Knight farm where the original Roundup tent village was. And that year they built a Roundup arena in Dewey at the north edge of town. And the first show there was in 1914. I was in the arena with a Camry. I forgot to tell you I was a shutterbug. I was in the arena for the first time in 1914 with a camera. And Mr. Bartles and I got along so well that I was invited to be his association photographer. And I served from 1914 on as the Dewey Roundup Association photographer. And I have probably 400 photographs that were made during that time or until the last Roundup was, I think, was in 39. And during 1920 show, Billy Parker, my first pilot, and I took the first picture that was ever made of a Roundup in progress anywhere in the United States. And while we were in the air taking this picture, Bill Smith, a rodeo man from the 101 Ranch of the Miller Brothers, the weather was hot and it was tiresome, and he picked a tough steer and he couldn't hold on to him, and the steer broke loose, backed off and walked up and threw him in the air, and that was the end of Bill Smith. We have several pictures that were made of those early day stars or Roundup men, and one I was looking at some pictures this morning of Floyd Gale, who was the arena director for Johnny Lee Wills Roundup in Dewey this past week. And I'm getting a bunch of pictures ready to send to him. Now then, our big interest in Bartlesville is the history room of our public library. And up to now, I have unrecorded probably 25 or 30 items that are on file up there. I have 45 other items cataloged and ready to turn over to them, and I'm working on some others. Now, I'm turning the information and the records and the maps and things over first. That will be followed by the photographs, and I'm retaining those to enable me to answer questions for the many calls I get almost daily that I can answer by the photographs, but I couldn't without them. Eventually, they will be turned over to the history room in the library here. Now, I think that's about got me cornered.
We have just had an interview with Mr. Elmer Sark in the city of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Your interviewer today has been James Cadigan for the Oklahoma Living Legends and the Oklahoma Historical Society on this day, May the 10th, 1972. On this day, May the 10th, 1972, we are having an interview with Mr. J.F. May, who lives at 1342 Hillcrest in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. This interview is being made for the Oklahoma Living Legends, and the interviewer is James Cadigan. Mr. May, let's start this interview off by getting some information about your background and what brought you to Oklahoma.
I came to Bartlesville in 1910. I was just a very young boy out of high school. And my brothers had preceded me. Two of them had opened a store in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1908. Another brother came to Bartlesville in 1909 looking for a location for another store. This brother's name was Ben. Not being able to find a location when he came to Bartlesville, he was told to contact a real estate man by the name of Clarence Burlingame. Mr. Burlingame sent my brother Ben to see Bill Johnstone, the fine old gentleman who was a pioneer in Bartlesville and owned a lot of property. He was about to build a building on the northwest corner of 3rd and Johnstone. My brother made a deal with Mr. Johnstone to rent the corner location, and in 1910, February, the store was opened and has been continuously there doing business since that time. In October 1910, I personally came to Bartlesville and joined my brother, and he put me to work. I worked for 4 years, saved up enough money to go to college. I then went to the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Commerce for 2 years, 1914 through 1916. In 1917, I joined the services, and I was in World War I for 18 months. After I came out of the Army, I located in Bartlesville, and I have been here ever since. I took charge of the store after I came out of the Army, and I now have my son Mike, who is with me in this store. I had 2 other sons, Jack, who was the oldest, now practicing law in Kansas City, Kansas, and John Lawrence, known as Larry, my youngest son, is a school teacher in Seattle, Washington. He's been teaching in the University of Washington for 5 years and is now working on his PhD.
Mr. May, since you have been here in Bartlesville since the early days, would you give us some reminiscence on merchandising in these early days, and just by a little comparison, what has happened since the early days in this the city of Bartlesville?
In the early days of Bartlesville, it was an oil town, and an oil town is what we call a man's town. Men, tool dressers, drillers, oil men flocked in here, and naturally the men's business was the most important business at that time. And Bartlesville was our second store. Our first store was in Tulsa, and then in 1917 we opened a store in Oklahoma City, and in 1920 a store in Muskogee. So by 1920 we were a chain store with 4 stores, which is probably the first chain store in the state of Oklahoma. The men's business changed a lot over the many years, due to the fact that Bartlesville has changed a lot in that time. It changed from an oil town where so-called workers and drilling oil wells to an office town. Naturally, their dress requirements were different. And we changed our lines of apparel, and today Bartlesville is a fine, wide-awake, up-to-date office town, well-dressed men, no better dressed anywhere in the country. I think
Mr. May, Bartlesville certainly must have a lot of color in past history. Would you reminisce a little about the Empire Oil and Gas Company, Mr. Frank Phillips, Mr. Wade Phillips, and the City Service Oil Company? Tell us a little history and a little color as you remember.
Well, I recall that the Empire Oil and Gas Company was the first really large oil company in Bartlesville, headquartered in Bartlesville. They had their first offices over May Brothers Store, which is known as the William Johnston Building. And Mr. Priestley was probably the first man I knew that's connected with the Empire Oil and Gas. This later became the City Service Oil Company, which came to be a big company employing hundreds and hundreds of people. Mr. Frank Phillips, I knew him personally. Also Wade Phillips. I was visited with him socially, and I admired them as fine businessmen, and they were always full of enthusiasm for making Bartlesville an oil center. Mr. Phillips developed his oil company beginning in 1917 into a company employing thousands and thousands of people all over the world now.
Mr. May, have you been connected with any of the local civic clubs or organizations here in Bartlesville?
Yes, I have. I've been active in civic work ever since I've been here, since 1910, which is 62 years. I was president of the Chamber of Commerce in 1937. I was president of the Kiwanis Club, and 1924, I was a charter member of the Kiwanis Club. I'm also a past lieutenant governor of the Kiwanis Club. And I've been active in practically every local drive and community effort over the many years that we've been here. Also, I think I should mention that I'm a charter member of the American Legion, James H. Teal Post 105. And I'm a 52-year Mason. I belong to pretty much everything in town, and so I'm 50 years of everything.
Mr. May, how do you remember the transportation facilities in the early days of Bartlesville?
Our transportation was mostly north and south. We had the Santa Fe Railroad and the MK&T Railroad. We also had an interurban system, a streetcar that ran from the smelters, which on the west side of Bartlesville, to Dewey, which is north of Bartlesville. This was an important part of our transportation system because the smelters, in the early days, there were 3 smelters, and they employed many people, into the thousands of employees. And of course, now we don't have passenger trains or interurban roads. Everything is automobile and trucks, but we'd still have freight trains on the Santa Fe and the MK&T.
Mr. Murray, since you have been a resident of Bartlesville for such a long time, could you give us your impression of downtown Bartlesville?
Downtown Bartlesville, unlike most downtown cities, has not depreciated, but has been getting better. They've been modernizing the storefronts and the streets and bringing them up to date. The downtown Bartlesville is popular as a shopping center because it is adjacent to the Phillips Petroleum Complex, which consists of 3 multi-story buildings and a bank building, which the entire complex employs over 6,000 people. They come to town to their jobs every day, and naturally it makes downtown the best shopping center that there is in this trade area. The residential sections have expanded out mostly east and south and southeast. They are very beautiful. They are well lighted and well paved, and 5-10 minutes, not over 15, to the most extreme residential sections.
Mr. May, what would you predict for a city like Bartlesville, the future of this town?
I'm glad you asked that. Bartlesville has a wonderful future. It's a great town to live in. Wonderful schools, wonderful churches, good place to raise children. It is big enough that it has every convenience. It's small enough that it's personal and you can raise your family and be with them. We have good fishing, great lakes all around here, good hunting. We have all the sports, golf clubs, country clubs, every type of recreation anybody wants. And we have wonderful living conditions. We have fine oil company who employs 6,000 people. We have good businesses. We have a lot of people employed here in the stores, good business sections. You can buy anything here in Bartlesville that you want. We have good transportation, good roads in and out of Bartlesville. I think the future of Bartlesville is very bright indeed.
We have just completed a delightful interview with Mr. J.F. May in the city of Bartlesville for the Oklahoma Living Legends, the Oklahoma Historical Society, on this date, January the 10th,